Shabbat Shalom. Beautiful congregation this morning here at Ner Tamid and online with us. Welcome. Before I started college in the late 1980s, a friend of the family said, "Shana, I'm going to give you a little piece of advice. Major in anything you want. The world is your oyster. But whatever you do, make sure you take some business classes." That was the best piece of advice I didn't listen to. Playing a lot of catch up now. Advice, unsolicited, excellent, good, bad, or otherwise, is a precious commodity that sometimes we only fully recognize the value of long after it is given. The art of giving and receiving advice, Harvard scholars David Garvin and Joshua Margolis begin their exhaustive study into advice for the business community, but it applies to everything, by quoting, perhaps not surprisingly, from the book of Proverbs, where we find such useful phrases as, "The way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice." Proverbs 12, verse 15. Proverbs 19, verse 20 says, "Listen to advice and accept instruction, and in the end you will be wise." And one more from Proverbs 24, verse 6, "For lack of guidance a nation falls, but many advisors make victory sure." That one might be a little bit of wishful thinking, but nonetheless, we understand what Proverbs is getting at. Some of these also sound like something we might receive in a fortune cookie at the end of a Chinese meal, and of course will be well recognized from other traditions around the world. The wisdom tradition, which seeks to inculcate ourselves and one another with good advice, sounds pretty much the same wherever you go. Take a second to think about someone who's given you good advice. Maybe you listened to it or not. Have you ever gotten any bad advice? That might have been the one we followed. And even today, who are your advisors? To whom do you go when the going gets tough? Has that changed over time? Do you have one main person? Several, depending on the situation? Maybe the person's no longer here physically, but you still hear their voice echoing, telling you to hold on to the banister every time you go down the stairs. I know, Daddy. I hear you every time. That's good advice. So who we go to for advice might be on the flip side, if you think of who comes to you for advice. What do you go through when you think of how to advise? Some people do so really impetuously, not much filter. And sometimes you really need to take a little while to think of how to counsel someone who's cared enough to come to you to ask for help. The Torah knows good advice. And in this parsha, we see a textbook example of it. Back to the Harvard scholars for a minute, David Garvin and Joshua Margolis. They suggest, after an exhaustive study, that when an exchange of advice giving is done well, people on both sides of the table benefit. Those who are truly open to guidance and not just looking for validation develop better solutions to problems than they would have on their own. They add nuance and texture to their thinking, and research shows they can overcome cognitive biases, self-serving rationales, and other flaws in their logic. Those who give advice effectively wield soft influence. They shape important decisions while empowering others to act. As engaged listeners, they can also learn a lot from the problems that people bring to them. And the rule of reciprocity is a powerful binding force. Providing expert advice often creates an implicit debt that recipients will want to repay. But they issue a caution. Advice seekers and givers must clear significant hurdles, such as a deeply ingrained tendency to prefer their own opinions, irrespective of their merit, and the fact that careful listening is hard, time-consuming work. The whole interaction is subtle and intricate. On both sides, it requires emotional intelligence, self-awareness, restraint, diplomacy, and patience. The process can derail, and getting it wrong can have damaging consequences. Not so much in Parshat Yitro. Here, we have Moses' father-in-law coming with Moses' wife and sons after a period of separation. And he comes to the scene, takes a look around after a night's rest, and says, "Oh my, this is no good." No good, by the way, is a very rare phrase in the Torah. Only appears a couple times. The other is in Genesis when God looks at the situation with Adam and says, "This is not good. Man should not be alone." And in effect, that's what Jethro says as well. "This is no good, Moses. It is not good for you to do this alone. The burden is overwhelming." "What are you doing?" he says. "Why do you act alone while the people are standing on you from morning until evening?" Moses says, "It's because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes before me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make known the laws and teachings of God." But Moses' father-in-law said to him, "The thing you're doing is not right. You'll wear yourself out, and these people as well. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now, listen to me. I will give you counsel. I'atzcha, etzah is advice in Hebrew. I will advise you, and God be with you. You represent the people before God. You bring the disputes before God, and enjoin upon them the laws and teachings, and make known to them the way they are to go and the practices they are to follow. Seek out from among the people a few good men who fear God, trustworthy men who spurn ill-gotten gain. Set them over them as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Let them judge the people. Have them bring every major dispute to you, but let them decide every minor dispute themselves. Make it easy on yourself. Let them share the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, you will be able to bear up, and all these people too will go home in peace." It's a long monologue put into the mouth of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, in case we were going to forget. The Torah reminds us over and over. This is extended dialogue, the likes of which we have in very few other places in our Torah. The Parsha is named after Yitro, the Midianite priest, who, because he's just enough outside the situation, has the clarity and perspective to see what needs to be done. That's the kind of advice giver we all need, and that we should all strive to be. He does it with diplomacy. He speaks softly but firmly. He absolutely empowers Moses. Notice he doesn't say, "I'm going to do it myself," which is, by omission, very, very powerful. He doesn't offer to help. In this case, in this family, with this people at this time, he knows his place. It's a perfect display of humility and a fabulous, extended, gorgeously constructed piece of advice. Think about how we give advice. Who's given it to you? When it's come unbidden, when it's been incredibly helpful and even life-transforming. This is classic. And in case we were wondering, is Jethro the only advice giver in this parsha? I would argue that he isn't. Moses, and thus the people that he delegates to, receive this advice beautifully. Takes them a while to work it out, and could be argued we're still working it out today, how to follow Jethro's advice. But as the parsha continues, and yes, it's been said that the so-called 10 Commandments are not 10 suggestions, but in a way, I would argue that they are perhaps the best set of pieces of advice that humanity has ever gotten. Hashem is the ultimate advice giver, the ultimate teacher through the mouth of Moses, who empowers us to make decisions and yet nonetheless firmly lays out the path we ought to follow. When we come to the end of the Haftarah, depending on how it's translated, but it's gorgeous nonetheless because it is the same in the Hebrew, a deliverer will come, a great person who will give wondrous eitzah, wondrous advice to the people. Pele yoetz el gibor, wondrous with advice, a God of strength, an eternal Father, a peaceable ruler. Friends, let us take the example of these extraordinary advice givers. Be careful and sensitive with our words. Let us heed the good advisors that are around us and march forward together in faith and with good advice. Shabbat Shalom.